Hello and welcome back to AmbiV. I'm Casper and today we're upgrading the 1967 Mustang's fuel system. Conservatively, it's 1,000,000 degrees in the shop today, but I need to get it started on this installation of the Sniper EFI on the Mustang. So the current setup on the Mustang is an old Carter 4-barrel carburetor, which was too big and very poorly performing on this car from the day I got it. This system should be a massive improvement, not only over the fact that the carburetor was missized in the first place, but because it's currently leaky and just poor performing. The way the Holley EFI system works is there's essentially a throttle body injection system that includes a computer and a map sensor that mounts where the carburetor used to be. That unit has fuel injectors in it and functions very similarly to the carburetor, with the exception that the electronically controlled fuel injectors can self-regulate based on what the map sensor and the O2 sensor are telling the computer to adjust mixture. So no more having to constantly fiddle with mixture settings based on altitude or current conditions that you're driving the car in. Additionally, this system I'm installing will also have a new fuel tank that contains a cradle and setup for having a submerged fuel pump. This should be a lot quieter than a fuel rail mounted external fuel pump, which is needed to retrofit on a system like this because the original system was a mechanically driven fuel pump at the engine, which would be far too low a pressure for fuel injectors. So to get started on the installation, let's look at the fuel tank and what they sent me and see what I need to do to get it set up to go in the car. Now that I have the fuel tank kit open and laid out before me, you can see there are essentially 4 major components to the system. There's the tank itself, which is a galvanized powder-coated unit already set up for each of the components they shipped with the kit. We then have the fuel sending unit, which is what tells your fuel gauge exactly how much fuel is in the tank. We then have the fuel filler neck assembly, which is the adapter from the tank back to the rear of the car where the fuel will actually come into the tank from. It's essentially a rubber hose, an adapter, a couple cork gaskets, and some various hardware for mounting it all in place. Then we have the fuel pump and the fuel pump assembly. The fuel pump assembly is essentially a pickup and return fuel line. So the pump will push fuel up one side back to the engine. Any unused fuel will be returned back down the return line and dumped back into the tank. It also has the pass-through for the wiring for the fuel pump. We then have the submersible fuel pump, which will sit down inside the tank and pick fuel up to send to the engine. We have a filter mat, which sits at the bottom of the fuel pump and filters out debris from coming into the fuel pump, as well as helping to wick fuel up if the fuel level ever gets that low. We also have some instructions, and it looks like some fuel-safe zip ties for securing it all in place. So let's start walking through the instructions and see if I can't get this all assembled to go in the car. Now that we have the carburetor exposed, we can begin to disconnect it from the car. In order to disconnect it, we must disconnect the vacuum line to the distributor, make sure we unplug and disconnect the electric choke, the fuel source, as well as the throttle linkage and any other lines that might be run to the carburetor. Once we have everything disconnected, I can remove the 4 nuts off of the bolt studs that come up from the intake manifold and lift the carburetor out of place. So let's go ahead and get to it. Now that the carburetor's out of the picture, we can begin getting ready to find out if we have the right brackets to adapt from the 4-barrel intake manifold back to the 2-barrel fuel injection setup. Now that the Sniper EFI unit has been mounted at the front of the car to the Edelbrock torquer manifold with the small adapter plate that I had to use to go from a 4-barrel to a 2-barrel standard pattern, I can now move to the back of the car. So last night, before I got too hot and tired, I finished assembling the new fuel tank, which consisted of trimming down the fuel level sending unit, as well as trimming down the fuel pump assembly to fit with the depth of the tank. Those are now mounted onto the tank and along with the adapter for the fuel filler neck. So that whole unit is done. I just need to drain the fuel from here, pull the lines, and get rid of this tank. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and pull the drain plug and see if I can get anything else out of this tank. Now that we have the fuel pickup line disconnected, the fuel drain from the tank, and the fuel level sender disconnected, I will cap off this hard line as I will not be using it in the new installation. I will be installing new 6AN lines for both the pickup of the fuel as well as the return for the fuel line. So this system won't be in use, but I also don't want it filling with spiders and junk. So I'm going to find some vacuum caps to put over this line. Once I have this capped off, I can move to the top side and begin dismounting the fuel tank from the car. Now that we're back up in the trunk, you can see the top of the fuel tank. The entire bottom center of the trunk is actually the top of the fuel tank. All this rustiness is actually the top of the fuel tank. This brown is the original color of the car. It was a copper gold color. And there's body seam sealer and filler materials around here that make it look rough, but there's actually only really rust on top of the fuel tank. So it looks like there's probably 10 to 12 bolts that hold this in place, and then the fuel filler neck. So I'll start by pulling the fuel filler neck and figuring out if these bolts will come out or not. Now that we have the fuel tank out of the way, let's go ahead and look at getting the new fuel tank in here, see how I'm going to seal it to the body since I don't have a gasket for that component, and start looking at where we can run our fuel lines. So now this gives us an idea of how we're going to have to route the lines. Unfortunately, I'm not too thrilled with the way Holley chose to set this tank up. The fuel level sender being here isn't a huge issue as they have a slight divot to run the wire in below the carpet, but having the fuel pump assembly here is going to be a lot more complicated because these trunks don't actually have much that covers this other than some carpet and some filler. So these fuel lines are going to be essentially exposed running to wherever they're going to run to before they leave the car. Now that we have the fuel tank in the car and I've got some of the basic cleanup done around here, we're ready to decide where the electrical and fuel should run. So I bought the master kit from Holley that included some Earl's rubber high pressure fuel line. This is pretty good fuel line, but typically when I'm building a system like this with AN fittings, I use the nylon coated stainless steel reinforced fuel line. It's just more durable when things might be rubbing against it. So if I were doing this for a one-time installation, I would probably take the time to make it out of the same material that I did with all my other cars. But this car will be getting an engine rebuild in the very near future, and so these fuel lines may only be in here 6 months before I redo them. So my thought is that I will use these rubber lines, run them to the length I want, and then when I do the engine rebuild, pull them back out of the car and use them as the templates to make a more permanent line. Now that we're back at the front of the car, the Sniper EFI unit will dictate where these wires can actually go. So before I drill a hole in the trunk, I need to get this blue wire, which is the fuel pump positive wire, mounted up here in the engine bay and then run backwards toward the fuel tank so that I can decide exactly how long and on which side of the car it will be coming down before I start drilling any holes. So to do that, we need to extend all these harnesses out and decide exactly where the best placement is away from anything hot or anything sharp.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about. Wait!
Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys. This place, that'll rock this place, that'll rock this place, rock this place, rock this place, rock this
From the beginning.
this place. That'll rock this place. That'll rock this place. Rock this place. Rock this place. Rock this place.
That concludes the installation of the Sniper EFI system on this Mustang 289. This car had a few issues that I don't know that other cars would have, and my efforts to use the matching Holley EFI fuel tank actually created more work for myself. So to start with, one of the big hurdles I encountered was that the Holley EFI fuel tanks fittings that say they are 1/4 inch NPT at the fuel pump assembly do not seem to seal with any of the 1/4 inch NPT fittings that I have here. I ended up having to go back into town for yet another brand of fitting and use Teflon tape in order to prevent them from seeping fuel out on the high pressure side. So there might be something wrong with their threading, or I might have been really unlucky with all the brands of fittings I tried. Ultimately, that added quite a lot of work, having to drill new lines and having to work around the fact that now there are lines on top of my fuel tank. Additionally, I broke one of the band clamps on the non-welded O2 bung system that they have. That's probably because their bands seem to be designed to accommodate up to almost a 3-inch diameter pipe, and these are very tiny main pipes on this 289 Mustang, and so it just got to the point where it was completely maxed out and actually broke before it had maxed the bolt out because of how much it had deformed. Fortunately, I had another clamp, so we got past that. The last issue that really added time was hunting down a suitable power source. This EFI system needs an ignition wire that has power without deviation at both ignition on and during cranking. If it loses voltage at all, it will reboot the unit and you won't be able to start the car because your ignition system goes away. So in order to accommodate this, I had to go back into the engine bay and tap into the brown wire that feeds directly to the starter solenoid for ignition. In theory, there's supposed to be a pink wire under the dash that you can use, but somebody's changed out all the wiring into multiple different colors under there, so I just had to give up and move on. I want to thank you all for watching this video, and stay tuned for a more all-encompassing review once I've given this system a chance to learn and get its feet under it so that I can be a little more fair in it. As of right now, the system seems pretty darn impressive, and other than these few issues and a slight issue with getting the idle dialed in, it seems to be working great. So again, thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.
Joint on a corner where the big boys play.